Hi everyone, welcome back to Counseling and Virtual Care. Last week we started to learn about the APS Code of Ethics, its principles and ethical standards. This week we'll look at specific aspects of the code outlining common problems in psychology practice. Specifically, we'll talk about privacy, confidentiality and informed consent. These concepts are really important because they relate directly to your second assessment, where you will need to select one of two possible case scenarios and identify an ethical dilemma. So, as you probably remember, an ethical dilemma could be something like multiple relationships where you and your client may know someone in common. These concepts will also be really handy in the future because if you decide to work as a psychologist, it's very likely that you will face some of these dilemmas at some point. For example, you may have to break confidentiality and that may not feel great. But you will want to be sure that you know you are acting ethically and you're following ethical principles and standards. So if you do have to break confidentiality, at least you will know you're doing the right thing by your client. Alright, as we just mentioned, in this video we'll talk about privacy, informed consent, confidentiality, multiple relationships, and other related concepts. These are core ethical standards in all healthcare professions, but are particularly important in psychological practice. These standards are contained within General Principle A, and that is respect for the rights of people and peoples, and are the cornerstone of psychological practice. But these ethical standards also relate to an important principle that is implicitly addressed in the APS Code of Ethics. Now, if you read carefully the definition of respect included in the APS Code of Ethics, you will see that they mention the dignity and respect of people. But they also talk about autonomy and justice. Funnily enough, autonomy is mentioned only twice in the APS Code of Ethics, but I think it's a really important principle. So let's look at what autonomy is. Autonomy is our individual right to self-determination, the freedom to choose and act in accordance with our personal values and wishes. So why is autonomy such a big deal? Well, think of an experience where your autonomy was compromised or interfered with by another person. What was that occasion and how did you feel? Well, I can give you an example. Let's think of refugees. In Australia, refugees coming by boat are usually placed in detention centres against their will until the visa situation is resolved. This can take many years, and in the meantime, refugees lose most of their autonomy. So while they're captive, they can't roam the streets freely or work or study or make a lot of decisions based on their own principles and wishes. So they are pretty much confined. I mean, we think about the refugees in this example that I just gave you, and we understand that their autonomy is constrained. But we have to ask ourselves, is autonomy absolute? Are there any circumstances in which restrictions on individual autonomy are morally or ethically appropriate? And if so, what could these be? Well, we can think of three cases where restriction on individual autonomy can be actually ethically appropriate. And these are age, physical ability, and personality. I mean, with age, makes sense. Individuals under 18 need to have their competency to consent assessed. Although this may vary depending on where you are in the world and circumstances, specific circumstances. For example, in Victoria, family courts may use age of 15 or 16 as a cutoff to determine autonomy. However, in other parts of the world, this cutoff or this age will be very likely different. Also, when we think about physical ability, we can see how certain disabilities may require other people like family members or partners to be involved in the decision-making process. For example, someone suffering from loss of movement and speech may need assistance in that process. But what about personality? What does personality mean in this context? Are we talking about psychiatric disorders like bipolar disorder, where someone may enter a manic state and then they may place themselves and others in danger? Are we talking about someone dealing with schizophrenia, where the distinction between reality and fiction may not be entirely clear? Or are we talking about personality disorders like paranoid personality disorder or schizotypal personality disorder? Now, I'll leave these thoughts with you, and you may want to look this up on the DSM to understand some of these presentations a little bit better and how this may relate, if at all, to these ethical considerations around autonomy or restrictions on autonomy. Now, another element to keep in mind is the cultural aspects of what autonomy means. Because autonomy is grounded in the ideology of Western individualism, where the cultural promotion of independent models of the self emphasize personal control and preeminence of individual rights and responsibilities. And I know that was a mouthful, but basically what we're saying here is that the Western model emphasizes independence. But if we think about Hofstede's cultural dimensions, we know that collectivist cultures may emphasize the self as we rather than me. And the sense of community may be more important than individual happiness, for example. So how do we negotiate a cultural sensitive stance on individual and collectivist ideologies in deciding what is the right conduct, both privately and professionally? We can use a case scenario to illustrate these thoughts and considerations. Let's read the case scenario we propose here together. And it says, you're a psychologist working in Australia when you agree to see a married couple for concurrent individual therapy. In one individual session, the husband tells you that he has a gambling problem and has borrowed so much money that the bank is threatening to repossess the couple's house. This could result in financial ruin for the family. The couple have 2 young children as well. He's ashamed of his problem and so refuses to tell his wife about his gambling and the imminent financial threat facing them. He also discloses that he's having an affair with a married co-worker, which he also has no intention of disclosing, as he fears it would wreck his marriage and result in the alienation of his children. Now, in your next session with the wife, she reports that rather than therapy helping her relationship, her husband seems more withdrawn and no longer affectionate. Also, having once been a kind and patient father, he now frequently yells at the kids, resulting in them crying and becoming fearful. The wife attributes this situation to her husband being stressed at work, which is what he tells her. But she is distressed by her deteriorating marital relationship and the negative impact on her mental health. She pleads for your advice on what she can do to help her husband and their relationship. Now imagine yourself in this situation. What feelings does it stir up in you? What ethical difficulties it presents regarding confidentiality and informed consent? Does the APS code provide any guidelines on how to act ethically in this context? How would you choose to act in this situation? And also, keep in mind what we said before. Are we attuned? Are we in line with the cultural considerations proposed here? Are there any cultural sensitivities in terms of a collectivist culture versus an individualist culture that we should be accounting for as psychologists? Now, before we are able to answer these questions, we probably need to talk about privacy, informed consent, and confidentiality a little bit more. So let's start with privacy. In a general context, privacy is the ability of an individual to be free from interference, intrusions, and to be able to freely associate with whoever they want. But also, privacy means being able to control who can access your private information and how this information is being used. Privacy nowadays is a big thing. Particularly, we tend to leave our traces scattered throughout the internet, and companies like Google or Facebook dutifully collect all those crumbs we leave as we navigate the web. More specifically, the issue of privacy is complex when we think about social media, because the assumption is that what we say is private. But posting on social media is like standing at your front door and starting to scream your private thoughts, frustration, and desires. And we may not be able to control who has access to our personal information and how that information is being used. So you can see how privacy can be a complex issue in our everyday lives. But this becomes much more relevant and complicated when we think about the counseling context. And that is because the premise in counseling is that clients will disclose very personal information. Perhaps they may say things in therapy that they haven't said before to anyone and may not say ever again to anyone else. So you can see the importance of knowing that our personal information as clients will not be divulged by the psychologist, and that we will be in control of how information is being used. That is why privacy is so important in this context. So let's now turn our attention to this idea of informed consent. When clients come to us to receive help, it is vital that they understand what they can expect. Informed consent is a procedure that entails providing clients with comprehensive information about the psychological service to be offered and gaining their agreement to take part in the service. There are 4 key considerations when obtaining valid informed consent. Firstly, the individual is considered competent. This requires a psychologist to determine whether the person has the capacity to understand the information provided. Secondly, consent is obtained voluntarily. This requires a psychologist to determine that the client has freely made their own decision about whether they agree to the service. Now, we should mention that there are some exemptions to this, for example, co-mandated treatment. Thirdly, it must be specific, and this means that the scope of what the client has consented to has been made clear. And fourthly, the information is clearly understood, which requires the psychologist to ensure that the information is communicated in a language that the client will comprehend. Now, the information that needs to be provided to the clients when completing an informed consent process is outlined in standards 𝓃𝒶𝑜𝓈 to 𝓃𝒶 in the Code of Ethics. However, we also require informed consent when we intend to collect information about clients from associated parties. For example, family members, doctors or health professionals or case support workers or things like that. Now, this is contained in standards 𝓃𝒶𝑠 to 𝓃𝒶𝑠. I recommend checking these standards to get more familiarized with these concepts because, again, this relates to your second assessment. And now we look at confidentiality. Confidentiality relates to the information we collect from clients during the provision of services and the promise that we make to them regarding how that information will be used and stored. Confidentiality is perhaps one of the most important aspects of client care. Psychologists are privileged to receive sensitive information from those they work with. Now, ensuring that this information will be respected and managed with care is a critical component of rapport building, and this is the cornerstone of your therapeutic relationship. Most importantly, confidentiality promotes respect for clients' rights and their dignity. It promotes the reputation of psychologists within the community and encourages people who may not seek help out of concern for what happens with their information when they engage in psychological treatment. Now, several standards within the code relate to confidentiality. The most obvious are those that fall under section A5, confidentiality. However, standards related to privacy and the release of information are also important. So I suggest reading standards A51 to A55, which relates to confidentiality, standard A4, which relates to privacy, and standard A6, which relates to the release of information. Now, the case scenario we saw before where the husband disclosed gambling issues and having an affair may make you question the professional function of confidentiality and whether it serves the greater moral good. Now, thinking about professional psychology, what happens if confidentiality is consistently undermined? Just like the case scenario proposed, there was a room for psychologists there to consider whether to undermine confidentiality. Well, we mentioned that confidentiality promotes confidence in the professional relationship, and this is a prerequisite for client self-disclosure and a working alliance. Confidentiality implies fidelity. Psychologists keep their professional promises. So in this context, the client trusts you on the presumption of implied, not always explicit, undertakings of confidentiality. If this condition of trust is missing, the client will not trust you, which means that open self-disclosure and thus therapeutic gain will probably not be possible. And the very effectiveness of psychological treatment rests on the strict adherence to confidentiality. So you see how this concept is really, really important. But here's an interesting question. Is anything more important than confidentiality? And is confidentiality absolute or unconditional? Now, before answering these questions, it is important to highlight the importance of the relationship between confidentiality and informed consent. Because confidentiality and acceptance of its reasonable limits rest on informed consent. And this is because informed consent ensures that the client is aware of the risk and benefits of the services being provided and is participating in these services voluntarily. Now, informed consent means that your client knows which treatment is being provided and how it could be beneficial, and also to look at any foreseeable treatment risks. But the client also needs to know about what confidentiality is, what are its limits, and how the information will be stored and used. So what we're trying to say here is that confidentiality is not really absolute or unconditional, and there may be situations in which you will need to break confidentiality. But it's really important that there is appropriate informed consent before this happens. In other words, if you believe you need to break confidentiality, you will need to communicate this with your clients so that they are fully aware of the situation and they know what they can expect. But let's put another spin to this conversation for a moment and let's look at ethical violations of confidentiality and informed consent. So intentionally betraying client confidence and ignoring the principle of informed consent is an ethically and legally risky undertaking. But this can be legally or ethically justified in certain cases. And these cases could include self-harm. So when the client poses a severe immediate risk to the self, so for example, suicidal intention. Harm to others. The client poses a severe immediate risk to identify others. So for example, if a client says, I intend to kill or injure this person at this time using this specific means, that's very specific and that puts someone else at risk of harm. We can also think about breaking confidentiality from an ethical perspective when there is compromised agency or incapacity. So here the client is temporarily or maybe permanently unable to make a sound judgment regarding the impact and consequences of their action. In these cases, their choice is not an informed and rational choice. So for example, in the cases of psychosis or drug or alcohol intoxication, or even in the case of intellectual disability. We can also consider this idea of developmental incapacity. Here, the client is a legal child and because of developmental limitations is presumed unable to decide what is in their best interest or to reasonably consider the impact of their own behaviors on others. And finally, we can think of a higher legal authority, for example, a court of law, deciding whether it is in the best interest of justice to require you, as counsel or psychologist, to break confidentiality. But in these cases, you will need to inform your client about your intention of breaking confidentiality. Now here's what the APS Code of Ethics has to say about disclosure of confidential information. It says, psychologists disclose confidential information obtained in the course of the provision of psychological services only under any one or more of the following circumstances. Firstly, with the consent of the relevant client or a person with legal authority to act on behalf of the client. Secondly, where there is a legal obligation to do so. Thirdly, if there is an immediate and specified risk of harm to an identifiable person or persons that can be averted only by disclosing information. And fourthly, when consulting colleagues or in the course of supervision or professional training, provided the psychologist conceals the identity of clients and associated parties involved, and obtains the client's consent and gives prior notice to the recipients of the information that they're required to preserve the client's privacy, obtains an undertaking from the recipients of the information that they will preserve the client's privacy. That's another mouthful, and basically this last point means you need to let your client know, or you need to communicate the idea that you may have to disclose at some stages, depending on the context, some information. So what about when we're working with minors? Minors under the age of 18 are regarded as not legally able to make treatment decisions. But are minors really all the same developmentally? So there are some exceptions. For example, we can talk about mature minors, and these are 14-year-old kids and over. These may be able or capable to understand the risk, benefits, and complexities of the treatment situations. But the psychologist must assess rather than assume the minor's maturity. Now, with kids aged from 0 newborns to 8 years old, the legal guardian is the client, so confidentiality obligations are to the guardian. However, psychologists should also attempt to gain informed consent of the child as well when possible. So we mentioned that in some cases, depending on the kid's age, the parents may be the legal guardians. But what happens when there's only one parent involved? For example, if there is a separation or divorce. So when there is no court order, one parent may legally engage a psychologist's services without knowledge of the other parent. But this proposes a bit of ethical caution and special considerations to keep in mind in this case. Now, if the parent requesting the service instructs the psychologist not to disclose any information to the other parent, the psychologist may choose to do so or may choose not to do so and actually disclose private information to the other parent. Again, this proposes ethical caution, so there has to be a lot of consideration around specific context, and the psychologist or counselor needs to apply clinical judgment. And what happens if we disclose information without consent? Disclosing without consent has serious implications for a psychological relationship and the reputation of the profession. So it's not undertaken lightly. But there are some instances where we may have to break confidentiality without obtaining informed consent. And some of these are, for example, obligation to report crimes. There is no general obligation to report minor crimes unless you aid and abet the perpetrator. So what distinguishes minor from major crimes? Well, we can think of major crimes, for example, in the context of treason. So treason must be reported, and this is considered terrorist activity. Now imagine what would happen if you told your client that, they tell you they're about to commit treason, and you tell them, oh look, sorry, I have to break confidentiality and I actually have to tell someone about this. Then the client will likely change their plans and perhaps not fulfill the treason act they wanted to, because they are aware that you know about the details and so on and so forth. So it does make sense to break confidentiality without consent. Similarly, when there is felonies or serious crimes, for example, involving death or serious injury, you may have to break confidentiality without consent. For example, someone saying, I'm going to hurt someone, or I've got an intention to murder someone. Then, of course, if you tell your client, hey, I will have to break confidentiality, once more, the client will change their plans and you may not be able to help that third party. So again, breaking confidentiality without consent. And finally, we can think of obligations to report abuse or maltreatment or neglect of children. But here's another controversial question. What about old people? Are they vulnerable? I'll leave you to think about that and perhaps discuss it in your live tutorials with your wonderful tutors. So that's all the content we've got for this video. stay tuned because we do have a second part this week. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next video.